Good afternoon, everybody. So, I don't know if you have a similar sense as me, but when I think back to the 2016 election, this time 4 years ago, there was this ambient feeling that the stakes were reasonably high, meaning that the winner of the election would have a substantial impact on the future trajectory of the country, maybe more so than most elections, although we have a pretty small sample size, so it's difficult to say with any real degree of certainty. However, the ascendance of Trump, the way in which he staged what was then called, I think with some sound reason, a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. He defeated the party's key dynasty in the Bushes. He fairly easily felled the top pundit choices within the conservative commentariat, like Marco Rubio. And then he found himself in what seemed like a fever pitch of existential warfare against who could only be, I think, characterized as the embodiment of a decadent, corrupt establishment in Hillary Clinton. And therefore, a certain segment of voters who had a maybe not so precisely defined antagonism toward the political establishment writ large ended up gravitating toward Trump, especially toward the end of the campaign, and he wins by a narrow margin. Now, these voters, I don't think you could characterize as ideological conservatives necessarily. Perhaps they had some roughly conservative social or cultural attitudes. Maybe their willingness to entertain the prospect of voting for Trump was mostly informed by their hostility to Hillary Clinton, whether that hostility was based on a rational assessment of what she represented or not. But either way, the factors that were present in the electorate converged to make it possible for somebody like Trump to win the presidency, which not so long before had been regarded as almost unfathomable. Now, I always had thought, and I have cited to you on this stream before, that Trump stood a greater chance of winning that cycle than was popularly assumed, and that was based on my reading of the polling data and my reading of other more tangible in-person experiences that I had gleaned. But nonetheless, those who say that they were sure all along that Trump was going to win, I don't think are, by and large, telling the truth. And he only ended up winning by a small margin in 3 states. So there was maybe some degree of randomness involved there. You had the Comey letter coming a little over a week before the election, which I think has been overstated by Hillary and Democratic Party apologists to explain away her failure. But at the same time, you can't totally discount that it may have had some impact around the margins. I remember being in southeastern Ohio reporting for Vice at the time on how people were making up their minds in those final days before the election. And I could get at least a preliminary sense that voters were aware of the Comey letter, maybe not all its exact details or what it indicated, but it was additional evidence in their mind for their baseline assumption that there was something fundamentally corrupt or unseemly about Hillary and her campaign. She had gone through the primaries almost as this pre-coronated figure, and then, of course, the DNC machinated to undermine Bernie in various underhanded ways by hiding debates, by merging resources between the Hillary campaign and the DNC far prematurely and in a way that contradicted their public assurances. The list goes on. And so to stand back, when I recall the 2016 election, and maybe what I'm about to say here is almost necessarily vague or amorphous, but it did seem to me at the time that the stakes were higher than would maybe ordinarily be the case for a national election, or at least high enough that something seemed like it was fundamentally on the line in terms of the outcome of the election. And I know people in the comments and people who tweet at me angrily and send me unhinged emails are not going to agree with this assessment. But I do have the feeling, and yeah, is it a feeling? Although I can give you reasons that I think form the basis of this feeling, but nonetheless, I'll admit up front that it is a little bit nebulous what I'm about to say here. But I'm somebody who's involved, or at least immersed in the day-to-day functions of U.S. politics on a more or less unending basis for the past 4 years. And it seems to me that this year, this election cycle, the stakes are substantially lower than they were in 2016. And part of that is maybe inevitable because Trump is no longer an unknown quantity in terms of how he would govern. When he was running, he had no track record in terms of nuts and bolts governance that one could look on to project forward as to what he might do. You really only had a bundle of instincts or impulses based on a huge amount of basically just pundit style musings that he would do every single day, from which to extrapolate some kind of projection for his governing prospects. And now we've had 4 years of that, and we don't have to get into the full discussion of Trump's tenure, but I would say that more or less his governance in terms of its actual policy consequences has been roughly in line with a less maximalist interpretation circa 2016 of what he could actually get done. Or in other words, this idea that Trump was going to blow up the system or that he would be some incredibly radical departure from his predecessors in terms of policy, in terms of governing agenda, has not exactly borne out. We've had polarization kicking in from even before he assumed office, and I don't necessarily lay the blame entirely on Trump for that to the extent that you want to dole out blame. Clearly, there was a hysterical opposition which impeded him almost as a matter of philosophy, not almost, definitely as a matter of explicit philosophy from the moment that he actually won the election. But he also then delegated so much of what he prioritized to the more conventional Republican DC apparatus, which is why they have no or very little disagreement internally as to the utility of Trump winning a second term insofar as it serves their interests, like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society. All these mainstays of the movement conservatism are virtually 100% on board with Trump, with maybe a few exceptions around the margins in terms of particularly foreign policy. But by and large, there isn't a whole lot of disagreement in terms of Trump being an agent for them who will serve their self-preservation interests. Whereas in 2016, there was a scenario, and this is a scenario that I theorized. I mean, I didn't say that it was necessarily going to happen. Who could say that with any certitude? But I mean, there's a way in which you could have imagined in 2016 that Trump might have not necessarily tethered himself to the institutional apparatus of the Republican Party think tank kind of complex in the way that he certainly has as president, and that might have opened up certain opportunities for governance that were closed pretty quickly. And again, when you have it just stated up front that the incoming president is a fascist who has been illegitimately installed into power by a hostile foreign nation, that being Russia, that kind of closes the window of opportunity in terms of what could be achieved with him on a bipartisan basis, because any collaboration could be and has been declared just that, collaboration with a fascist menace whose main function in the U.S. political system, they declared, was to tear it down, was to dismantle the norms, so-called, which have been the foundation of U.S. democracy since its founding. So how could you, if you are a right-minded person, if you have any fidelity to the constitutional order, if you want to preserve democracy for future generations, how could you, quote, collaborate with that person to get something done like, I don't know, infrastructure, or maybe coming up with a quote unquote compromise in the area of healthcare that draws on Trump's earlier instincts as a political figure when he would go around saying things like maybe single payer healthcare isn't such a bad idea. Maybe he could have been collaborated with, quote unquote, in terms of doing what he says that he wants to do but doesn't actually do, which is diminish the influence of the military industrial complex in terms of setting the agenda for a U.S. foreign policy. I mean, that hasn't happened to any real extent, aside from Trump's rhetorical overtures to, in some broad sense, wanting to do that. I mean, one of the reasons why people get so blinkered over Trump, from his supporters to his opponents, is that what is genuinely novel about Trump, what is a true departure for Trump in terms of the meaning of his presidency, is his communication style. I mean, it's off the wall every day. Now, maybe we're inured to it. How could you not be after 4 years? It's just not surprising anymore. But we shouldn't lose sight about his tweeting style, about how his pundit musings every day are genuinely different from pretty much anybody who preceded him. And people latch on so intractably to his communications, his public presentation, that it forecloses any possibility for them to actually examine what tangibly has been done on a policy level in terms of the opportunities that have been given to lobbyists. Who's lobbyists? What have they gotten? What about the donors? Sheldon Adelson, now we've heard this week, is going to be dumping another massive sum of money into Trump's reelection campaign. Well, what does that indicate? Because I remember in 2015, in the early portions of the Republican primary, Trump mocking Marco Rubio as somebody who was just going to be a puppet of Sheldon Adelson. And now we have Sheldon Adelson as the top financial benefactor of Trump and the Republican Party. Well, there has to be some significance of that in terms of the governing agenda. Let's figure out what that is. But, you know, for the most part, you're not going to get any dispassionate assessment of whatever dynamics have given rise to this change of heart vis-a-vis somebody, just for example, like Adelson. Because everybody is so constantly fixated on the public communications, which again is an actual departure, that they miss the forest for the trees. And Trump's vulgarity or his coarseness or his unorthodoxy, purely in terms of his public presentation, is really all people can think of when they think about Trump. They don't look at what the actual fruits of his governance are. And now, why do I begin with this prelude? Because the title of this video is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but gets to the feeling, however amorphous, that I laid out at the beginning, which is the 2020 election important or not? Now, every election is important to some degree. Yeah, it does, quote unquote, matter who runs the executive branch. But as we hear constantly in the commentariat from this or that pundit across the spectrum, this election, so we're told, has apocalyptic consequences. It's so significant that it's the most important, perhaps, in U.S. history. You have everybody from Bernie Sanders to Trump himself, Charlie Kirk, everybody in between. They don't agree on much, apparently, but what they do agree on is that this is the most important election, I don't know, since the dawn of mankind. Today, Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times, I happened to just be reading one of her columns on whether or not it makes sense for the Democrats not to be having a robust, quote unquote, ground game due to the pandemic. And she just adds, as an aside, as though it doesn't require any justification, that of course the stakes of this election are apocalyptic. That's the word she used, apocalyptic. Now, with everybody seeming to agree that there is this existential significance to this election, where does that leave me, just as a guy who I would like to think is relatively informed about U.S. politics? Well, I kind of find myself mostly wanting not to agitate in favor of Biden or to agitate in favor of Trump, or even necessarily to agitate against them, although, as I've mentioned, I am going to be doing a series of pieces, in October, making what I feel is the most rational case against both Trump and Biden. And then you can make up your mind in terms of your own voting behavior. But the broad thrust of where I keep finding myself analytically, not to be pompous, but I do try to analyze U.S. politics from a variety of different angles. I keep finding myself mostly wanting to dispel the catastrophizing. And I've done a video on this already, but it bears repeating because it's only going to get worse as the election approaches. Which is that, I'm sorry, bub, but you, Charlie Kirk, and you, AOC, both have a vision of the meaning of this election that is astoundingly untethered from reality. Now, I don't say necessarily that they're equally untethered, but when I hear Charlie Kirk, who has been elevated by the conservative infotainment complex as though he's some kind of philosopher king, when really he's just a continuation of these dopes that every so often get picked out by the the elderly Republican donor class as the spokesperson for the youth. When I hear him saying that Trump is the final guardrail against the collapse of Western civilization, and then I hear AOC or her acolytes saying that fascism is on the ballot, meaning if we don't vote Trump out of office and get Joe Biden in there, then America is going to transform into a fascist dictatorship. I think that there should be room in the middle, not as a centrist. I don't consider myself a centrist, maybe temperamentally in a way, but in terms of policy preferences, no. But how about just analytical centrism in terms of just attempting, at least, to provide a rational explication of what the actual stakes, quote unquote, of this election genuinely are? And they don't fall into either bucket. I'm sorry. And the fact that you have propagandists on left and right churning out this almost comically hyperbolic interpretation of the 2020 election should tell you that that's designed to manipulate you. Maybe not consciously. I doubt AOC or Charlie Kirk have the mental wherewithal to know or to be aware that they are manipulating you, but that's the practical impact. So my plea is for us to, for at least me, I can't control what you do, but what I'm intending to do is to give the most clear-eyed possible assessment of what this election entails. And I'm increasingly of the mind that, sorry, but this is one of the less important elections in recent history. Not that it's unimportant. Not that you shouldn't vote if you feel the need. But in the grand scope of U.S. history, I would say this is definitely less important than 2016. I'm not sure that it's somehow more important than 2008 or even 2012. You know why? Because for all their hyperbolic bellicosity against one another, there are a lot of things that would be fairly constant in a Biden presidency or a Trump second term. Now, they're both screaming that one another is a puppet or a shill for China, and yet I don't see much in the way of evidence that their actual governing approach toward China will be that much different. You know why? Because I actually read government documents outlining what the policy of, for example, the Pentagon is toward China. And you can go read these. They're freely available to the public, where the Pentagon has what it calls a great power competitor position vis-a-vis China and Russia. And by the way, I don't think the Russia policies would be all that different. Would the communication style be different between Trump and Biden? Would Biden intone that Vladimir Putin must pay a price for interfering in our election, whereas Trump won't do that to the emotional satisfaction of so many people in the media? Yeah, that's a difference. But if that's the only difference that you care about, then you are incredibly superficial and you're missing the reality of what is going on in the government, which I would think might be your priority if you're somebody who at least believes yourself to be an attuned commentator. But Trump hasn't improved relations with Russia. Relations with Russia have been demonstrated to be at a low over the course of his presidency, and you could identify a wide number of reasons for that, including the fact that the domestic political incentives militated against Trump fulfilling what had been his pledge in 2016, which is to, quote, get along with Russia. I mean, he still repeats this maxim of a supposed desire to get along with Russia, but it just doesn't comport with the actual policy record. INF treaty being abandoned as a result of the urgings of people like John Bolton, who, for all their fury against one another now, John Bolton was setting much of the agenda in the National Security Council for a year and a half. And during that time, guess what? The INF treaty was ripped up, meaning that the U.S. and Russia have less vehicles to achieve nuclear non-proliferation. And it all gets back to the fact that the policy in the Pentagon is going to be roughly the same in terms of this great power competition framework that underlies what actions are going to be taken to curtail or to contain, for example, China. Go look at Victoria Nuland, who is not Victoria Nuland, I'm sorry. Michelle Flournoy, who is likely to be at least considered for the defense secretary position should Biden win. And she has, I'll link to this piece. This is by Andrew Basovich, and he provides a good summary. She has an essay from a few months ago in terms of what the policy would be in the Democratic administration toward China. And there's not a whole lot there that Trump would differ on. It's just a matter of public presentation. And that's what people get so hung up on and frenzied by that it's all they can think about. So guess what? The likely defense secretary under Biden probably would continue the lurch toward new Cold War that we're seeing today under Trump, notwithstanding his insistences that, for example, he wants to get along with Russia. Then why are we funding so many nuclear arms programs? Why are we constantly giving these massive subsidies to the military-industrial complex that Trump putatively rails against, but have never been better off? Maybe that's an overstatement, but are perfectly content with his administration in terms of their financial fortunes. I mean, Lockheed Martin is not opposed to a Trump second term, nor would they be particularly opposed to a Biden second term. So there's so much more continuity than you would get the impression by if all you do is look at these apocalyptic pundit proclamations about how either Biden is going to institute some kind of bizarre Antifa left-wing tyranny, or Trump is going to do full-on fascism, whatever the hell that means. So try to be sensible about this election. I know it's difficult when you're commentating online because the algorithms don't incentivize non-catastrophism. They want you to be as agitated and as angry and as emotionally effusive as possible because it serves their profit interests. And again, all that is not to say that I would necessarily object if somebody could put forward a reasonable case to say vote for Biden or even vote for Trump, although that was never a possibility for me. But let's just go with Biden. Is there a reasonable case that maybe Biden being in office would improve things around the margins? Possibly. Is there a case that Trump being in office as opposed to Biden could improve certain things around the margins, maybe in certain foreign policy domains, maybe in terms of not allowing certain cultural radical chic to infiltrate the federal government, possibly. But again, all of it gets so occluded by this nonstop hysteria that really is more about driving you nuts so that you become a loyal soldier of a partisan political party and on all their media affiliates and hand over your money and click your links and such, than striving to give you a rational perspective on the election. And so that's my basic point. And just to conclude, I want to show you a foremost example of this, which happens to be on the Trump as a fascist side. Although I'm sure I could definitely find plenty of examples on the Biden is an Antifa guy side. Here's one of my good friends, not a friend, but I'm saying somebody who I've been aware of for a while. His name is Max Berger. Believe it or not, this guy was involved in Occupy Wall Street back when that was a thing. But of course, he became a total careerist. And now what he's saying is, quote, the most surreal part of living through a fascist coup is that we're not even talking about it as such. So his contention there is that we are living in a fascist coup. Wow, that would be pretty scary. So Trump is the president, has been the president for nearly 4 years, and yet he's mounting a fascist coup because for some reason, despite being a fascist, he couldn't get it together to enact the fascist dictatorship that everybody prophesies is his ultimate goal. Instead, what the Republicans, who controlled all the branches of government for 2 years, decided to do was try to unsuccessfully repeal Obamacare. They couldn't even get that done, and cut corporate taxes. Whoa. That's never been tried before. That's totally fascism, Max. But when you see unhinged, just nutty proclamations like this, interestingly, much of the time it comes from banal careerists like this guy, Max, who apparently needs some kind of emotional gratification to justify their banal careerism, so they lapse into this incredibly apocalyptic vision that is coincidentally shared by much of the media. And I could find plenty of Republican examples as well, because the reality of what they represent is just so much more, again, banal than they would like to let on. And so they have to resort to this cheap theatrics. And so my advice is to not get yourself saddled in this. Can you have a belief as to what the preferable outcome would be in November? Sure, but that doesn't require you to become a sputtering moron. Okay, so a couple of super chats here. Let me look through them. Stev asks, why are states like Colorado, Virginia, and New Mexico still considered swing states when they voted Dem since 2008? Well, I don't know who you're saying considers them to be swing states. In pretty much every model or what have you of the 2020 election, those three states are not considered particularly swingy. But it is true that, for example, Virginia might be the most interesting of those three in a way, because Obama was the first Democratic president to win Virginia in 2008 since, if I'm not mistaken, Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So it went 40 years as a strong non-swing state for Republicans. And then when Obama won Virginia in 2008, it was seen as maybe not exactly surprising, but almost a watershed moment in terms of the electoral trajectory of Virginia. So for Virginia to become such a solid state now for the Democrats is an insight into what the Democratic Party consists of now. maybe let's say over the past 10 or 15 years in terms of the changes demographically. Obviously, you have Northern Virginia is probably ground zero for what the contemporary Democratic Party most looks like in terms of the demographic changes, where it's increasingly a party where the base that is most catered to is affluent suburban professionals. Clearly, Biden is attempting to appeal to them. Hillary tried fruitlessly in 2016 to appeal to them, but I'm not sure that it won't be as effective for Biden, because it was sure effective in 2018 in the midterms. The seats that were won by Democratic challengers against Republican incumbents tended to be seats in the House of Representatives that were where you had the Northern Virginia type voter who maybe is a bit of a swing voter, may have been a Romney voter in 2012, repulsed by Trump's character or whatever, doesn't like the fact that their tax deductions were taken away through the 2017 tax reform bill in terms of property taxes or whatever. And so they're sort of ripe for the pickings for Democrats. So the Virginia is an interesting one. New Mexico and Colorado, I think they have had population influxes from out of state in terms of just interstate, particularly Colorado, in terms of interstate migration patterns that have made it so that the Democrats are stronger than they had been 10 or 15 years ago. Whereas it's the reverse in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Democrats probably stand a good chance to win those this year, but they've been trending more Republican because of population outflows, especially in Michigan. But yeah, I mean, there's a Senate race this year in Colorado where the incumbent Senator Cory Gardner, a Republican who won in 2014 when you had very low turnout, is probably the most likely incumbent to lose to a Democratic challenger for the Republicans on top of Arizona. But if you had to bet on one Republican incumbent losing in the Senate race in 2020, I would probably pick Cory Gardner of Colorado, which shows you something about the population trends. But whether those are swing states, I'm not so sure. RBGH fam says, thank you for your work on always remember large government equals money laundering for elites. Yeah, debatable. Marcus Will says, if Trump kicked Kushner, things could be different. Well, we'll never know. And it wasn't as though it should have come as a surprise to anybody that Jared Kushner would play a central role in developing the Trump administration's governing strategy, because he played a central role in developing the Trump campaign's strategy in 2016. And he's also related by marriage to Trump. So he's part of the package. And so I see like more of these right-wing people who are sort of disaffected with Trump now coming up with these alternate universes where, oh my goodness, if Jared Kushner weren't there, maybe things would have gone better in terms of achieving our nationalist, ambitions that we had imbued onto Trump. And, but Kushner was there all along. So you get what you pay for in terms of the results of that strategy. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. And we will chat again soon. So as always, stay safe, stay cool, etc.